But then we kind of move on to, so that's journalism, and there's kind of this broad definition of journalism. You can think about it many different ways. We're specifically thinking about data journalism, which obviously not all journalism can be data journalism, so we need to think about what is data journalism, and maybe when we have synchronous time together, we'll do some brainstorm or discussion. But I've just pulled, again, a couple tweets from folks talking about this. So one, whether data journalism is journalism reminds me about when we argued whether digital photography was real photography. So sometimes people say that data journalism, it isn't real journalism, but I think this is an old tweet. That's from 10 years ago. I think that perspective is fading somewhat. Here's kind of another perspective. Data journalism is journalism, and every journalist should be a data journalist. That's kind of on the opposite extreme. Every journalist should be a data journalist. A colleague of mine, Rodrigo Zameth, is a journalism professor, and he writes papers about journalism and data journalism and what it is. And he says that there's no generally accepted definition. There's different ways to think about it. So the process of extracting useful information from data, writing articles based on the information, and embedding visualizations. The application of data science to journalism, that could be one way to think about it. Gathering, cleaning, organizing, analyzing, visualizing, and publishing data to support the creation of acts of journalism. And then, there's scholars who've distinguished journalism through the form of its content. So if it's a story whose primary source, or peg, the kind of thing that the whole story hangs on, is numeric, then that counts as data journalism. And, is quantitative information a central piece of the story, and is there a visual element? So again, we can talk about this when we have class together, but, does there need to be a data visualization in an article for it to be data journalism? And does it need to be hanging on something numeric to be data journalism? I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. So I think Zameth has explained some of the things that data journalists do. Again, I just wanted to summarize some of these. So part of a data journalist's job would be to get data. So that might mean scraping data from the web. It might mean making a Freedom of Information Act request, which I'll talk about more in a second. Sometimes that means following up by emailing government officials or people who work at a particular company many times. Could consist of, converting PDF data to usable data. Sometimes you get really neat, flat file, tidy data as a journalist, but I think that journalists work with really weird, messy data, maybe more often than other types of data practitioners. Data journalists, of course, need to do data analysis so that they can summarize that raw data into something that they could write a story about. And they need to keep track of their work, in particular because journalism has this element of fact-checking, where anything that makes it into the article needs to be fact-checked. And sometimes the things that they fact-check are super silly. Like if you read a celebrity profile, someone probably went and fact-checked that the food that they talk about eating with the celebrity is really on the menu at the restaurant that is mentioned. So journalists really want to be telling the truth. And so sometimes editors are doing fact-checking, sometimes peers are doing fact-checking, sometimes journalistic organizations employ people whose main job is fact-checking. But those people have primarily been trained to do fact-checking on the sorts of facts like I was just explaining. Is this food on the menu? Following up, making sure that that person's job is what we said it was. Making sure that people were actually where they said they were at a particular time. And the data piece of it is a newer element. And so it's really important for data journalists to have some way that they've kept track of their work so that if someone says, I want to fact check this number, they can back up what they did and show the whole process. Of course, Data journalists have to write stories, and they probably have to interview people. So I'm having you read some stuff about interviewing data, which is different, but maybe similar to interviewing people. But just because data journalists focus on data doesn't mean that they get to ignore the other parts of journalism, like going out and doing interviews. So just a little bit more detail about a couple of those things. I have taught a full semester class on data journalism, and in that class we do a lot more of these practices that data journalists need to do. So one thing that I've had students do is file Freedom of Information Act requests, so that's a FOIA request. And what this means is in the United States, any data that the government has is technically available to its citizens, and particularly to its journalists, because journalists need to be serving as a sort of foil to power. They need to be able to have transparency to see what's going on. So this applies to basically all government data unless it's classified. And so one of the ways that the government collects information on people is through FBI files. And I got this assignment from a data journalist who does a similar thing, but you can make a FOIA request for the FBI file of someone. For living people, the only way to get an FBI file of a living person is if you make the request about yourself. So I could request my own FBI file. But once a person is dead, you can make a request of anyone's FBI file. So in this assignment, we find obituaries of people who've passed away, who we think might have an FBI file, and then we file a Freedom of Information Act request. So this is the FBI file of one of the people that one of my students in my data journalism class requested, and it's got information about the activities that the FBI was keeping track of. You can see that parts of it have been blanked out, probably for, classification reasons, but we got many pages of this document, which was pretty interesting. Other times the government comes back with, sorry, there's no file on that, or, for some secret reason we can't give it to you, which is maybe the most interesting. But this process takes a super long time. So this is one of the first assignments that I have students do in that class, and oftentimes by the end of the semester, not everyone has heard back. So we're not doing that in this class. Another thing that we are not doing in this class, but I've done with my data journalism class, is extracting data from PDFs. So this is something that government agencies love to do. Either they do it kind of unintentionally, just because they think that a PDF is something that's going to be useful to people, or they do it intentionally to try and obscure data from people who want it. So the nicest way to be able to analyze data is if you get it in a CSV file or an Excel file, but oftentimes government data is provided as a PDF. So I'm interested in the Flint water crisis, and there's data on the blood lead levels of children in Michigan, and it gets released every year. So there's years and years of data in these PDFs. You can kind of see when you look here. But it's not something that you could read into Excel or R or another piece of software. And so you need to be able to extract the data out of the PDFs. So there is a tool called Tabula, which was developed by data journalists to extract data from PDFs. And there's mostly a graphical user interface way to use Tabula. There is an R package that does the same thing, but it's a little bit finicky. The whole thing is really finicky. But you essentially import a PDF in a particular way and find a table. You have to define the sort of size of the table really neatly, make sure that you capture everything. There's ways to preview the data and see, okay, it's not looking quite right, it's not formatted quite right, and then you can export it as maybe a CSV file. So I had students do this when I taught this data journalism course, and we extracted all of the data out of, I think, 4 years worth of PDFs. There's multiple tables in each PDF, and again, it was a huge effort to get that done. But this is, again, something that data journalists do on a regular basis because they need data that's kind of locked in an inconvenient file format. So again, that's not the focus of this class, so I'm not going to have you do that exercise. Although if, when you're thinking about your final project, you're interested in data that's locked in a PDF, I can show you how to use these tools. Mostly I just want you to get a sense of the real broad variety of things that data journalists are doing. And we'll do this activity when we have synchronous class. I'd like us to look at some articles, some pieces of journalism, and try and analyze the structure, look for those elements like the lead and the nut graph and the kicker, see if the article uses the inverted pyramid. Many articles do, but of course, the rules are there to be broken, so sometimes there's different versions. And then try and see if you think that the article is data journalism, if it counts, or what about it makes it count as data journalism. So I've selected some articles, but you could think about any article that you're interested in and analyze that structure.